Perfect. Right. On which point we're coming up to 10:51. I think we've answered all of the questions there, Peter. Thank you very much for your contribution. We have a few minutes, folks, before we move over to Dr. Nathan Hazlehurst, who will be talking on the second subject. So I will propose, Nathan, we can get you set up. Let's have our second presentation for today. The recording is in progress. So, Nathan, I shall hand the floor over to you to talk us through your experiences around the casualty services and civil defence within London. Over to you, Nathan.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to Lamas for asking me to present to you this morning. Just by way of introduction, my name's Nathan Hazlehurst. I am a current student at the University of Salford in Greater Manchester. As you can probably tell from the accent, I'm not from Salford in Greater Manchester. I am from Wolverhampton in the West Midlands. But I am a PhD student looking at the role of the casualty services and the emergency medical service in the UK in the pre-war and Second World War period, examining their preparations, operations during the conflict, and also how they influence modern practice. I'm a part-time PhD student. I do currently work for the National Health Service as an emergency planning manager, that incredibly long way of saying emergency planning that the NHS enjoys. I'm also a member of the Institute of Civil Protection and Emergency Management, which is the academic professional body for emergency planners, and is the successor of the Institute of Civil Defence Studies, which was founded in 1938. And I currently serve as the historian for the Emergency Planning Society, which is the other professional body. What I'm going to take you through this morning is a little bit about casualty services in general, why they came to be, what they did, and then how London differed, why London differed, and then finally, how these services influence modern practice around emergency medicine today. So for me, resilience and recovery are integral parts of what I do in a day job. Resilience in terms of preparing for incidents and being able to respond to incidents, and that recovery is how we take those lessons and build into what you will hear a lot in the press is called the new normal. How we learn to embrace what's now appeared. So I hope to be able to show you a little bit of that this morning. Just to give you an overview of casualty services. Casualty services were conceived after the First World War. We often forget the naval bombardment in 1914 on the east coast of England around Hull, Scarborough, Whitby by the German Navy, and then later the aerial bombardment of cities, including London, by Zeppelin airships, and later Gotha heavy bombers. The response to that was piecemeal, and the response was very much almost a postcode lottery. Where you lived would depend upon how good the response would be. Until 1915, the London area did not have an accident ambulance service. It had the Metropolitan Asylums Board that would provide patient transport for those going to the fever hospitals. And it had the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police who were responsible for casualties in the street. It wasn't until 1915 that the London County Council created an ambulance service. This was under the fire brigade or under the leadership of the chief fire officer. And London probably had one of the better responses to that aerial bombardment. But central government recognised that even that response wasn't good enough, and that with the advent of aerial bombardment of civilians, the next war was going to have as big, if not worse, effect. In fact, in 1923, the Royal Air Force was commissioned to do a study, and they found that in the first day of war, if there was no mitigation, so if there were no fighters, there were no anti-aircraft guns, there was no civilian protection, the best air force in Europe at the time, the French, would be able to drop the same tonnage of bombs on London that the Germans dropped over the 4 years of the First World War. That resulted in the ARP Committee, Aero Precautions Committee, that was set up in 1924. This worked realistically secretly until 1935, when the ARP Committee became the ARP Department of the Home Office. This department created a series of memoranda, of pamphlets, of handbooks for services. What do we do? How do you set these up? And Casualty Services was memorandum number 1. It was the first service that was outlined. This memorandum was sent to every county and county borough council, and I'll explain a little bit why London was slightly different in that. And they were given this template. In 1938, local authorities were mandated that they had to set up these services. It took 3 years because of finances. There was a disagreement between local government, central government around who would pay. But casualty services were designed to supplement peacetime medical services, and it also created war-specific units. Peacetime medical services, we have to remember at this time, were not nationalised. They were led by local areas. The Ministry of Health didn't really have a national role. The only national services weren't in England. So in Wales, the King Edward VII Memorial Association did a lot of work around TB, and there was a national TB service. And in Scotland, the Highlands and Islands Medical Service was run by their Department of Health. But in England, there was no centrally organised service. Casualty services were initially overseen by the ARP department, later the Ministry of Home Security, but post-1939, they finally relented and allowed the Ministry of Health to look after some of the health services. And what did they look like? First, and at the very top, was your Medical Officer of Health. They were the senior doctor for the county or county borough council. They were always a male at this point in time, and they had a wide-ranging brief. So before ARP came into being, they were looking after hospitals, ambulances, the need to deal with infectious diseases, right the way through to public sanitation, drains, nuisances. They all fell under the Medical Officer of Health. And in 1935, when the memorandum comes out, they're suddenly given this raft of new responsibilities. Many appointed a deputy purely to deal with the ARP, civil defence side of their work. And during a raid, the Medical Officer of Health or their deputy would be sat in a control room with the ARP controller, the chief warden, the chief fire officer, etc., coordinating their personnel. And one area that they created very quickly was an incident medical officer. That was a doctor who lived in your locality, it was usually a GP, and their role would be you'd be on a rota, and on your night, if a bomb was dropped, if there was an incident and you needed a doctor on scene, the incident medical officer would be deployed. At this point, again, doctors were private entities. Most councils issued them with medical kit so that they would not be able to charge the cash back to the council. First aid parties, stretcher parties in London were responsible for going to the scenes of incident. If there was an incident, people were trapped in a house, your first aid party, your stretcher party would be deployed, work with the rescue services to find those that were trapped, check their injuries, triage them, stabilize them, extricate them from where they were trapped, and hand them over to ambulance services. They were also responsible for gas decontamination of people if gas attacks had been used, and if an invasion had occurred in the United Kingdom, they were to be assigned to the Home Guard to assist the Home Guard with medical treatment. It wasn't until late 1941, early 1942, that a Home Guard medical service was created. And in many areas, that was still just civil defence. And they would go in the wonderful car in the top right of the slide. You would fit about 4 people in that, and you would have stretchers on the roof. You had first aid posts. First aid posts initially focused on gas, with the opportunity to put a plaster on someone. Post 1938, 1939, when the Ministry of Health took them over, they essentially were created into minor injury units that we would know now, with a doctor and trained nurses that they could even do minor surgery on site. They were usually attached to a hospital in the outpatients department, so that minor injuries would go there and the casualty receiving room would not become as busy. There were also mobile first aid posts. These were designed around vans or lorries, or in some areas buses, and they were meant to go to the scene of large-scale attacks. What you found was that in the early stages of the Blitz, these units were hated. They were slow, they were heavy, they would rarely get to the scene of an incident before it was over. So areas created light mobile first aid posts. They were a car with a doctor and nurses on board, and they would go to the scene to provide that advanced clinical care at the incident. You have ambulances and sitting case cars. Sitting case cars were literally that. They were private vehicles that the ambulance service would use, put minor injuries into them and take them to a first aid post. Ambulances, the ambulance in the bottom right is a London County Council ambulance. It is a Talbot from 1935. This exact ambulance is still owned by the London Ambulance Service in their historic collection, which is based in Kemsing in Kent. And that vehicle went through the Second World War. That was a pre-war ambulance. Wartime ambulances, as you'll see later in a photo, were usually cars with a wooden box body on the back, and they were designed to carry 4 patients to a hospital. Your staff manning those ambulances were given basic first aid training. If you needed anything beyond that, you would be sending a stretcher party. Casualty receiving hospitals were your hospitals, so your standard local hospitals that were divided into a number of categories, from category A being they had the full range of services, what we would now class as a general hospital, all the way through to former workhouses, then called public assistance institutions, which were often described quite unkindly in reports of they were there to decant excess patients into. First aid points were initially created in rural areas and later adopted by the WVS, the Women's Voluntary Service, and they were houses. They were predominantly in outer London areas or outer areas of urban districts. And they were just the district nurse or the GP's house, or the local pub in many cases. And they would have first aid equipment, they would have a couple of stretchers, and they were the locality where local volunteers would train and would deploy from in an incident. They were never designed to be somewhere where people would receive treatment. They were where the volunteers could go to then go out. And the final one, and the one which unfortunately I've had significant experience over the last year of working with, the successor to this, is the mortuary service. The government recognised that significant numbers of dead were likely from air raids, and the existing public mortuaries would not be sufficient. So temporary mortuaries were created with dedicated volunteers and vehicles. And casualty services were often associated with the Civil Nursing Reserve. This was a body jointly run by your local committee of the Royal College of Nursing and your medical officer of health. And this was a means for individuals that had had some nursing training to volunteer as nurses, both in hospitals and in civil defence, and others who wished to become nurses could go on a course and join the Civil Nursing Reserve. An important point to note is that the Civil Nursing Reserve did not discriminate between men and women wishing to join, and indeed is one of the few organisations at this time that encouraged men to become nurses, in that they recognised that male nurses would be of immense use in civil defence. At the time, men were not allowed to join the main nursing register. You couldn't be a male nurse in the military. You could be a nursing orderly, but you weren't allowed the title of nurse until the 1980s in the British military. And the predominant location where men were nurses were mental asylums. So at this point, having the ability to become a nurse providing treatment to normal casualties was seen as a significant departure. Now, London. Why was London different? Apart from London's always different. The main reason's two-tier government. The London boroughs and the London County Council each had their own right to run the full range of services that came under our raid precautions. There were also the issue that at the time, the London County Council ran the ambulance service and the fire brigade. There were discussions as early as 1935, when ARP was first made official and public, that the boroughs wished to disband the London Fire Brigade and the London Ambulance Service and move them back into the boroughs. Conversely, the London County Council wished to take on civil defence in its entirety and would run it themselves. This ended up requiring the Home Office to intervene, and they created a compromise that really didn't suit anyone, but which actually did work during the conflict. That was that London would be designated as a region in its own right. It had a central team, including a Civil Defence Commissioner. The Civil Defence Commissioner for London later became the only Metropolitan Police Commissioner who had served as a senior civil servant. The Metropolitan Police has only ever had judges, police officers, and military officers as its commissioner. This was one individual that had actually been a civil servant. And it had a dedicated headquarters building. It's actually the building that now is used by the Natural History Museum. It was a brand new building. It was made of concrete and steel, and it was deemed to be appropriate. The fact that there's large numbers of windows didn't seem to concern them at the time, but they later did have to use several hundred, equivalent of hundreds of pounds now, of tape to protect the windows. And from a casualty services perspective, they were split. Now, this is something that is almost unique in London. In most areas across the country, if you had a county council with urban and rural districts underneath, the county would run casualty services. But in London, where you had the London County Council, but you had boroughs that were unitary authorities in their own right, there was a split. Ambulances were run by the county council. And the image, the bottom image there, you can see a standard ambulance. And on the top image, you can see ambulances and first aid cars. The London County Council also created something called the London Auxiliary Ambulance Service, the LAAS. In many areas, they didn't have a peacetime ambulance service. So where London did, they created the auxiliary to support the LCC ambulance service. The LAAS was almost entirely manned by women, and there were posters at the time encouraging women to join as ambulance drivers and attendants. One of the sites, or one of the last sites to be recognised, is in Weymouth Mews in Marylebone, and there is a blue plaque on the wall to that station where a lady called Angela Raby served, and she did write a book which was published by After the Battle Press and is still available. I know Foyles in Tottenham Court Road seems to always have a copy when I go in. Stretcher parties, first aid posts and hospitals were run by the boroughs. The only exemption to that is any hospitals that were already run by the London County Council. But stretcher parties and you can see some stretcher parties on the image where my cursor is next to the cars. They would be from your borough council, and they would be usually volunteers from St John Ambulance Brigade and the Red Cross Society. Later, others joined when the Red Cross and St John ran out of volunteers to give. And then the first aid posts would be run inside the hospitals. And like I said, ambulances were run by the county council. They went from 30 accident ambulances in 1938 through to approximately 300 vehicles capable of carrying accident patients. I'm just going to go through some modern equivalents. This is the bit where you can really see the recovery and the evolution that the war created in casualty services and emergency medicine. So I'll start at the top with stretcher parties or first aid parties, or stretcher aid parties, I've called them there because I managed to miss deleting the word. The image on the right-hand side, this image of people is personnel of the Hazardous Area Response Team of the London Ambulance Service. Hazardous Area Response Teams were created after the 7th of July 2005 bombings, and their role is to go into areas which normal paramedics and normal ambulance personnel should not be entering. Their role is to decontaminate patients, to help extricate patients from trapped buildings or vehicles, and in the event of terrorist incidents, they will wear the outfit in the top left in the full ballistic PPE. As a result, they are the natural successors to the stretcher parties. Fixed first aid posts, they're your minor injury units that you have across London. You have a significant number of minor injury units or walk-in centres across the capital. They are your fixed first aid posts. They can often be nurse-led, but it's where you can go if you don't need the full range of hospital services, but you still need to be going in. And they're often based in hospitals, as the first aid posts were. The light first aid posts, the light mobile first aid posts, well, the natural successor to those is HEMS. It's the air ambulance, and it's the air ambulance cars. The whole idea of a light mobile first aid post was to deploy doctors and nurses to provide advanced clinical care at the incident scene. That meant drugs, that even meant traumatic amputations at the incident scene. That's exactly what HEMS do to this day. Casualty hospitals, they are your A&Es. They are your hospitals with your accident and emergency departments. They're also your major trauma centres, where you've got that specialist care distilled into that single location. And ambulances, the LAS ambulance service still exists today. It's now the London Ambulance Service NHS Trust. And the concept of having an ambulance service that focused on treatment of casualties, accidents and incidents with a patient transport arm really was born in the Second World War. My conclusion, and I've got one more slide after this, but my conclusion is this is an area that does not receive the level of study that other areas of the home front receive. There are official histories of the Second World War, and the 2 emergency medical service volumes, which have just been reprinted by the Naval and Military Press, they are brand new that they have been reprinted. They've never been seen before, realistically, and they're not quoted anywhere because nobody looks at casualty services. The work of casualty service and civil defence was vital in saving life. Over 1.2 million people served in civil defence in one way or another during the Second World War. The youngest was 14 as a messenger in the West Midlands who lied about their age. The oldest were in their 60s. It was also a service that had no gender barrier. Men and women were paid the same, something that was really pushed by a liberal member of the House of Lords, who's related to Helena Bonham Carter. Elements of casualty services are the modern emergency medical service. And it also highlights areas of the home front that aren't studied. And especially within London, if you look at the work that emergency medical service did and casualty services did, you can then see why, when incidents occurred in London, like the Moorgate Tube disaster, any train incidents in London, why the London emergency services have always been very good at responding. That's because of the Second World War and because of the experience they had. And then my final image, this is from South London. And these are railings. They're railings in a number of boroughs in South London. If you look at the image on the left, you can see that the railings are actually stretchers. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, these stretchers weren't needed and weren't wanted by anyone. The emergency services didn't want them and St John Ambulance didn't want them. But the London Borough had lost their railings because they'd been melted down. So they turned the stretchers on their side and used them as railings. And there is a London, I believe it's the London Stretcher Society or the Stretcher Railing Society that campaign to preserve these. So it's a tangible element of casualty services that you can still touch today and see today, and something that shows that in adversity, we will always find a means to build and to innovate. So thank you very much. And does anybody have any questions for me?
And thank you, Nathan. Thanks very much indeed. And attendees, you can send a little thanks in to Nathan using the chat emoticon. But if you have a specific question, you can find the Q&A at the bottom of your screen just by floating your mouse down there, or use the Alt key if you prefer. And Nathan, I do have one question coming in for you from Richard Gilpin, who said his father was in the Friends Ambulance Unit in central London in World War II. Who would they have reported to?
So the Friends Ambulance Unit, very good question, would have reported into the London County Council. So there were a number of units like the Friends Ambulance Unit, like the American Red Cross, it sends an ambulance unit over, that were used to supplement the London ambulance service. And they were realistically, they were just used as extra ambulance crews. The Friends Ambulance Unit was actually one of the better trained. So in comparison to some of the auxiliary ambulance service teams that were essentially trained on how to keep a tourniquet tight, how to give someone a hot water bottle and keep them breathing till they got to hospital, the Friends Ambulance Unit were given decent medical training so that their ambulance crews could also provide medical care at the scene of an incident. But yeah, they would report into the London County Council Ambulance Service.
Thank you, Nathan. I've got a couple more questions for you. One that you might not be able to see comes from Thamer McIver, and Thamer asks, can you tell us how the system worked in Middlesex? There's a question for you.
Yes. So the counties, so Middlesex, Surrey, where I am now, it would have been the county council. So it would have been the county council that would have run the ambulances, and it was usually the county council that would run the full range of other services. What you'll also find is that those counties that bordered London would have a direct phone link into London Ambulance Service Control Room at County Hall, because if there was an incident in those outer areas, you would have a lot of mutual aid and leakage of ambulances from one side or the other would be asked to cross the border. But yeah, it would be run at a county level through County Hall. So for Surrey, I used to work for Surrey County Council. Our ARP control room for Surrey was in Kingston at County Hall. Unfortunately, the area where the county, the control room was actually destroyed by a V-bomb at one point, which they rebuilt and put the emergency management team into that portion of the building, which we felt was quite appropriate. Have put the emergency planners into the side of the building, which was bombed in the Second World War.
Thank you, Nathan. And we have one more question in the Q&A that we might just need to have a little think about and work out. It's from Alex Werner. Alex tells us about a display in the Museum of London's People's City, and goes on to say his label was used by emergency and rescue services during World War II. Is there a collection of such things elsewhere? We might not have the full question there, but does that mean anything to you in there, Nathan, around collections?
If you're meaning in terms of kind of uniform and insignia, there is some in other museums across the country. Most town and city museums have a little bit around the Blitz. The Imperial War Museum has quite a good bit in its new Second World War gallery. And there is another website which I will put into the chat if anybody would like to see it, which is Civil Defence Insignia. It is a website that just does civil defence insignia, so you can see the full range of weird colour-coded things that were designed at the time. But yeah, so lots of museums across the country will have it. If it was looking at the Q&A, emergency and rescue services, that would probably be if you were part of the rescue parties, so you would have a big R that said London underneath. They would work with the stretcher parties, and they were often in many areas from the building trade, or were trained by the building trade, and they would be the people physically digging patients out, as well as shoring up buildings or demolishing buildings, depending upon how badly damaged the building was.
Thank you. And thank you, Nathan, for your presentation there. And again, we have that recorded for people who might want to follow up with you at some point.